Thank you very much. Jazakumullah khairan. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. I am grateful to you for the invitation. It's always been a great pleasure to be in Malaysia. The idea behind the book, Hamas Unwritten Chapters, goes all the way back to about 2003. At that time, Palestinian territories in the West Bank, as they are called, of course, Palestine is Palestine, the whole of Palestine. But Palestinian territories is a term that refers to the areas that were occupied in 1967 by Israel, that is the West Bank and Gaza. The rest of Palestine was occupied in 1948. In 2003, those territories were still heavily involved in the second Intifada. The first Intifada erupted in 1987, the second Intifada in 2000. And what was interesting about the second Intifada is that it seemed to announce the death of the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Agreements, as they are known, or Accords, were signed between Israel and the PLO in 1993, and they were understood by the Palestinian side to eventually lead to the establishment of a Palestinian state next to the Israeli state. But nearly 7 years passed, nothing happened along those lines, and the situation was only deteriorating. In 2000, toward the end of the office or the administration of President Bill Clinton, a summit conference was held in America at Camp David that brought together Yasser Arafat and Ehud Barak, who was the Prime Minister of Israel at the time. And then the conference failed, and the talks ended without agreement. Now we know from the details that are available today that Yasser Arafat was actually expected in exchange for being offered a Palestinian state to give up Palestinian jurisdiction or authority over Masjid al-Aqsa, something which he couldn't accept. That would have amounted to political suicide. So he went back, and the Palestinian people, who had been losing more land and suffering more persecution under Israeli occupation, started or ignited the second Intifada. September, we're talking about September 2000, nearly about September 2000. I was approached soon afterwards in 2003. So we had been by then 3 years into the second Intifada. I was approached by my publisher, who published an earlier book for me, Hearst in the UK, who published for me in 2000 the book called Islam and Secularism in the Middle East. And he said to me, it feels like Hamas is going to be the future. We need a book on Hamas. Are you willing to write a book on Hamas? Well, it was an exciting idea. I thought I was in a very good position to write a book on Hamas. Many of Hamas leaders are my friends. Khalid Mish'al, in particular, we grew up together in Kuwait. We went to school together, graduated together. So I had good access to the movement, to its leaders, to its documents. All I needed really was time. Writing a book is not an easy thing. Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala meant for me to write the book. So I was offered a fellowship by the Kyoto University in Japan. So I could take time out and just go to Japan, away from all the busy schedule in Britain at the time. And I started researching the book, doing interviews, collecting data. and the book was almost ready to be published by the time Hamas won the election in 2006. So Hamas election brought it to the fore. It became the talk of everybody. What would happen to the Palestinian issue from now on, etc. And my book, being published around that time or just after that, became a main source material on this movement, which had become of considerable interest to all those who were concerned. Now, if you want to write about Hamas, you have to begin with the roots. Where does it all start? How did it all begin? And I found it only sensible to tell my readers Hamas' birthplace and what it was before that. Hamas was born in 1987, December 1987, when the first Intifada erupted as a result of an Israeli army vehicle driving into a minibus carrying Palestinian laborers and killing most of them. That was the spark that ignited the Intifada in December 1987. Again, after the Palestinians were suffering for so many years. So these eruptions, these revolutions, don't just come like that. Usually they are preceded by a lot of frustration, a lot of anger. And that anger becomes like a barrel of dynamite. And then all you need is just
ignition.
Yes, and then it will, you need to ignite it and then it will go. But the interesting thing about Hamas is that it did not start from scratch. You already had a huge movement in Palestine that on the night of the 9th of December 1987 was transformed by a decision from its leaders into the Islamic resistance movement in Palestine. What was that movement? It was Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun, the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Ikhwan al-Muslimun in Palestine had already been in operation since at least the mid-40s. And we're talking about 1944, 1945, maybe 1946. When members of the Muslim Brotherhood came from Egypt and established the first branch or shu'bah, and that then spread all over Palestine, as it did spread all over the Arab world, because those were the years when the Muslim Brotherhood expanded out of Egypt into Syria, into Iraq, into Sudan, into Lebanon, into the Arabian Peninsula, into various places. But Palestine was, or had a story with the Muslim Brotherhood, because in 1948, when the Zionist gangs came from Europe and worked for the establishment of Palestine, the Muslim Brotherhood were among the most important mujahideen groups that tried to prevent this from happening. So Palestine had a history with the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood had a history with Palestine. Why didn't the Muslim Brotherhood start earlier? Why wasn't Hamas created at an earlier stage? We had the first occupation in 1948, and we had the second occupation in 1967. But still, the Muslim Brotherhood continued to work, confining itself to social and educational sort of da'wah. And there is a reason behind this. And the reason was what happened in 1948. In 1948, the Muslim Brotherhood tried to fight, tried to prevent the creation of a Zionist entity on the land of Palestine. But it was Arab governments at the time that conspired with the Zionists and paved the way for the creation of the State of Israel. It was the regime in Egypt that punished the Muslim Brotherhood, the Muslim brothers who went from Egypt to fight in Palestine, imprisoning them upon their return, and not only that, but also collaborating with the British to assassinate their founder and leader, Sheikh Hassan al-Banna. So there was a sense within the Muslim Brotherhood, not only in Palestine but across the region, that Palestine cannot be liberated unless we do something about this situation. You cannot have a successful jihad campaign if you are being stabbed from the back. So the overwhelming conviction within the Muslim Brotherhood is that our task now is first to prepare society. So you start from the individual, you move to the family, from the family to the community, from the community to the whole ummah, until you reform society, and then society is able to establish a state, call it an Islamic state, call it a caliphate, call it whatever you want, but a state that truly represents the wishes and the desires of the populations. And that's why a group of young Palestinians in the mid-50s, we're talking here about 1956, 1957, who were members of the Muslim Brotherhood, decided that their leadership was not doing the right thing, that we have to have jihad. They were enthusiastic about fighting against Zionism to liberate Palestine. We're talking here about what, 5, 6, 7 years only after the creation of Israel. And they came together and formed the movement that became known as Al-Fatah or Fatah. So Fatah originally was founded by mostly former Muslim Brotherhood individuals. The body of the Ikhwan in Palestine did not go along with this idea because they told them, you will see, you will not succeed. The Arab governments will not enable you to do much. And of course it's a long story. I mean, in my book I try to explain briefly what happened to Fatah and some things about the PLO, and in order to pave the ground for telling the story of Hamas. But what happened after 1967 is that the Palestinians started feeling that they were let down by the Arabs, they were let down by everybody, so they had to do their own job. The so-called Palestinian nationalist movement, which was leaning towards the left, even the former members of the Muslim Brotherhood who formed Fatah left their Islamic roots and became more secular, more leftist. The balance of power was not in favor of the Fatah movement or in favor of the PLO. They went from trouble to trouble, first in Jordan, where we had Black September, as it is known. They were kicked out of Jordan, they went to Lebanon, and then we had the civil war in Lebanon. They were kicked out of Lebanon. They ended up scattered around the region, in Tunisia, in Sudan, in Yemen, and in Syria. So it wasn't, it was actually a very sad story. All this continued until around the early 80s, when a new trend emerged within the Muslim Brotherhood itself, saying that it is not enough to continue to prepare socially and educationally, and we need to do something about it. And that's when Sheikh Ahmad Yassin, rahimahullah, in 1983, attempted to create the first military apparatus within the Muslim Brotherhood. Unfortunately, they were discovered by the Israelis, and he was jailed together with all his aides, and that brought to an end that attempt. The rest of the movement, many of its leaders didn't know about what Sheikh Ahmad Yassin was doing. He was later on blamed and told and reminded that the situation is not yet right, it's not ripe for something like this, until things became really bad within the West Bank and Gaza, and we saw the incident that happened on the 8th of December 1987 that led to the eruption of the first Intifada. And it was then that the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood met on the 9th of December and decided, this is the moment we have been preparing for, this is the moment we have been waiting for. And they wrote a communique that only reached the media on the 14th of December, saying that the Muslim Brotherhood from now on becomes the Islamic resistance movement in Palestine, and the acronym became known as Hamas. So Hamas is actually the abbreviation, Harakat Muqawama Islamiyya, Hamas, but it means in Arabic enthusiasm or zeal or courage. So it has a meaning as well. Hamas did not find it difficult to work because it already had an entire infrastructure. Unlike Fatah in 1957, Fatah was founded by a few individuals who met in Kuwait and decided to do something about Palestine, but they didn't have any infrastructure yet, so they had to work for it. Whereas in 1987, the Muslim Brotherhood already had chapters across Palestine, they had charitable organizations, they had schools, they had lots of following, and that made it a lot easier for them to start the movement and become active quite rapidly. Initially, the movement used basic resistance tools. But then, as the Israeli occupation reacted to their activism, they had to react or act back by developing their tools, whatever tools they had. The turning point in the history of this armed struggle was with what became known as the War of the Knives. A group of individuals who were chased by the Israelis, who were wanted by the Israelis, came to the conclusion that they were going to be killed anyway. So if we are going to be killed, why not kill before we are killed? So they used knives, and then after the knives, they managed to grab or steal a gun from the Israelis, and then after that more guns, and then they developed other tools. So actually the 9th of December 1987 declaration came at a time when the movement didn't have a blueprint. They didn't have a plan as to how we are going to resist occupation. But with the passage of time, this progressed and developed depending on how the Israelis were dealing with them. The more brutal the Israelis were in persecuting the Palestinians, the more innovative the Palestinians were in developing new resistance techniques. Then Hamas very soon became a well-known name. Probably in the beginning it was ignored, but eventually the world recognized it because of another major development. And that major development happened in April 1994. Just 2 months before that, in February 1994, which was actually the mid of Ramadan, the 15th of Ramadan, an Israeli settler from New York by the name of Baruch Goldstein sneaked into Al-Haram al-Ibrahimi, the Ibrahimi Mosque, which is in my hometown in Hebron, and sprayed Palestinian worshippers while they were in ruku', kneeling in Fajr prayer. That massacre shocked Palestinian society, and it was then that Hamas devised the martyrdom operation. They responded to that massacre in April 1994 with a series of what the Israelis call suicide operations, what Hamas called martyrdom operations. The Israelis did not expect that. It was shocking for them. A number of Israeli army officers and intelligence officers went to see Sheikh Ahmed Yassin in his prison, because he had already been imprisoned, and said to him, how do we end this? How do we stop this killing? Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, probably some of you know about him or read something about him. he's a man, he didn't speak much, but if he spoke, his words were really powerful and meaningful. He said to them, stop killing us, we stop killing you. They said, how? He said, let's have a truce. And his words in prison were actually the beginning of thinking within Hamas that developed afterwards, and I have an entire chapter about it in my book, about the long-term hudna or the long-term truce theory. How can we end the killing or stop this mayhem without giving up on our rights? In other words, Hamas, as a matter of principle, believes that the whole of Palestine is Palestinian, and that Israel is just another colonial project, just like other colonial projects that came and went, and therefore one day it will have to go, like the Crusaders, like the British colonizers, like the French colonizers. The French, after all, stayed in Algeria for about 130 years, and then it came to an end. So Hamas, as a matter of principle, does not accept a de jure existence of the state of Israel. But how can you come up with an argument that accepts a de facto existence? And that's what I explained in that chapter about hudna or long-term truce, which at one stage, actually, and especially after my book was published, attracted a lot of attention in Israel. I was approached by very senior Israeli politicians, by former top Israeli military officers, through European mediators, and they asked for a close discussion about the concept of hudna. How does it work? And how can we guarantee that it works? Now, unfortunately, now we are past all of this, because the reality on the ground has been changed considerably, that there is no room anymore for such a disengagement leading to the creation of two entities, one Palestinian and one Israeli, without mutual de jure recognition. But that actually was the case at the time, and my chapter on the hudna led subsequently to a number of unofficial deals between Hamas and Israel that led to truces. And in every single case, it was Israel that breached the truce and not Hamas. It was Israel that violated it rather than... Anyway, in my book, I also discuss Hamas political thought, and I'm very critical of its charter, the first charter. Probably my critique of the charter was the first of its kind from within the Islamic circle. I say in that chapter that the charter was a big mistake. It was detrimental to Hamas and to its cause, because it was written in a rush. It wasn't thoroughly thought about. It adopts conspiracy theory, which is nonsense. It doesn't explain how the world works. It borders on anti-Semitism, which is not an Islamic position. A Muslim cannot be an anti-Semite, because anti-Semitism is a European phenomenon that is associated with racism and with discrimination against the Jews in the 18th and the 19th century Europe. But also it confuses Jews with Zionists. Here I explain in the book that our conflict in Palestine is not with the Jews. The Jews are people of the book, just like the Christians. Their rights are recognized in Islam. They lived with the Muslims throughout the centuries. When no other civilization recognized the other, actually the Muslims recognized the other, until modern times, when we had secularization and democratization and human rights, and then the world entered into a new era. And therefore, to consider the Jews to be the enemy is a big mistake, because there are many Jews around the world who sympathize with our cause. They recognize that we are the victims of this project. Not only that, Zionism was actually anti-Jewish in its origins. And you can read a lot about this in the writings of Abdul Wahab al-Nasiri, in the writings of people like John Rose, who wrote a very interesting book called The Myths of Zionism. Also now our friend at Oxford University, Avi Shleem, who has written on this. Ellen Pape. There are lots of Jews now actually who have written about this, that we Muslims cannot even write better. So I was critical of the charter, and I called for writing a new charter. And in my book, I even provide some sort of an outline what the new charter should look like. The book that I wrote in terms of history continues to be relevant, because at least the first 5 chapters or 6 chapters are about what happened. And if you really need to understand the Palestinian problem and where Hamas happens to be positioned, these are essential chapters. But if I were to rewrite the book today, I'll probably make some amendments to the latter chapters in the book, or probably I should write a new book, which I might do, because so much has happened. My book, the latest edition, deals also with what happened in 2007, when there was a conflict between the Fatah and Hamas that led to the separation between the West Bank and Gaza in political terms. Of course, geographically speaking, they were separate by occupation. Let me now conclude with something about what I might include in the book if I were to rewrite it today. It never occurred to me when I wrote the book, when I concluded the book, that we would end up in a messy situation in the Arab region as we have today in the post-Arab Spring. After the counter-revolution destroyed the various Arab revolutions in Egypt, in Tunisia, Syria, in Yemen, etc., the Palestinian cause emerged as the primary victim of all of this. Inasmuch as the Palestinian cause was likely to end up as the greatest beneficiary from a change in the region towards genuine democracy or democratization, the crushing of the Arab revolutions has had its toll, a very heavy toll, on Hamas and on the Palestinian issue. Today, Hamas is under siege, and as much as Gaza is under siege, not only within Gaza, but also in the Arab world. Today, we have a new alliance that has come into existence, that brings together Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia together with Egypt. And they are doing all they can in order to suffocate Hamas and pave the way for what people today talk about of being Trump's new initiative known as the deal of the century. The idea behind the deal of the century, although the details are not available to us in abundance, but the idea behind the deal of the century is to just forget about Palestine and the Palestinians and get the Arabs and the Israelis to end the conflict between them and normalize relations. Actually, the UAE and Saudi Arabia have already gone a long way in normalizing relations with Israel, sometimes openly, but most of the time discreetly. Now, the main challenge facing Hamas today is what to do about this. When you are expected to make compromises that until recently you insisted they were not acceptable, that many of the sources of support you had are no longer available, or are being offered with unacceptable conditions. When you've lost Syria, because Syria was a great supporter of Hamas until the Arab Revolution started. Hamas also had its relations with Iran suffer, because Iran was a major supporter, but then because Hamas disagreed with Iran in Syria, they lost that support too. And the rest of the Arabs, the Egyptians in particular, are tightening the siege on Gaza and on Hamas. What I would, of course, suggest if I were to write another chapter or write another book, is that compromise is not the way forward. Because if you look at the region as a whole, every player in the region is in predicament. Life is tough for everyone, even for those who are creating problems for the Palestinians and for Hamas. Mohammed bin Salman, who is posing as a reformer in Saudi Arabia, is actually destroying Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Zayed is doing something similar to the United Arab Emirates. So these are the main culprits who supported the counter-revolution, as a result of which the Palestinians are suffering today. In Egypt, Sisi, who came as a result of the support of these dictators, is also destroying Egypt from within. So in my opinion, in long-term struggle, there are moments where the winds are not in your favor, the balance of power is not in your favor, but that does not justify giving up on your principled position. Because soon afterwards, things will change again. And it's not over in the Middle East. The region is so dynamic, so much is going on. It's not the best times for the Arabs, but I believe we are marching toward the eruption of the second round of Arab revolutions. This is very similar to what happened in Latin America, what happened even long before that in France with the French Revolution. You have an eruption of revolution and then you have a counter-revolution. Then you have another eruption of revolution and you have a counter-revolution until the balance of power locally, regionally and internationally is changed. What really matters is that Hamas came into existence because Fatah sold out from the point of view of the Palestinians and agreed to accept the legitimacy of occupation in Palestine. So if Hamas were under pressure to do the same, that will be the end of Hamas and there will be someone else. There will be, just as we are talking about waves of revolutions, we talk here also about waves of national struggle. There will be another movement. So the best bet for Hamas leadership is to remain steadfast and to be frank with the Palestinian population, with the Arabs and with the supporters of Palestine worldwide, that yes, these are not the best of times, these are difficult times, but we are not going to give up on our vision, on our ambition of seeing Palestine, the whole of Palestine, liberated from Zionism. And I've just remembered that I probably should mention that in my book, when I criticize the Hamas Charter, I call for a discourse that is humanistic and universal. Because Hamas, like any other national liberation movement, is not only talking to a close constituency, to the people surrounding you. You are no longer a Muslim Brotherhood organization talking within the cells of the organization. You are speaking to the world. And we need to speak about what happened in history, the roots of conflict, and we need to distinguish between Jews who are part of Zionism and Jews who are not part of Zionism. And we need to explain the struggle also in a language, in a discourse that people in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, in North America can relate to and can understand. I think I probably have spoken for too long. Maybe I should just stop here and give you some chance to interact.